In early December 1325, Edward II was at Westminster dictating letters that were to be sent across the English Channel. These letters were of absolutely vital importance. On the 1st of December, the king composed a letter to his absent queen Isabella and also one to her brother Charles IV, King of France. The following day, Edward then wrote to his and Isabella's son, Prince Edward, who had recently turned 13 and was caught in the middle of a parental argument that would ultimately destroy Edward II. The argument centered around a certain Hugh Despenser the Younger, who had become overly familiar with the king. Hugh wielded undue influence over Edward, casting Isabella into the shadows. This was not the first time Isabella had been insulted in such a way, but she was determined that it would most definitely be the last. Edward had initially sent Isabella to Charles's court on a diplomatic mission, and she would take the opportunity to refuse to return to England point blank, at least whilst Edward remained fixated with Hugh Despenser. Isabella would have known, given Edward's earlier history with Piers Gaveston, that the king was highly unlikely to surrender his friendship without a determined fight, but with Prince Edward now in Isabella's control, she had a very powerful weapon to use against her husband. In his initial letter to Charles IV, Edward II writes, "Our companion, the Queen of England, dares not return to us, being in peril of her life, as she apprehends from Hugh Despenser." Edward then predictably goes on to defend Hugh, saying he never perceived any ill will from Hugh aimed at Isabella, whilst claiming that Isabella had professed affection and friendship for Hugh. Edward was certainly being played for a fool, but by whom? It seems to have been both Hugh and Isabella. He concluded by begging Charles to return Prince Edward to him. The desperate king then turned his attention to Isabella herself. To her, Edward expressed his grief of heart at Isabella's lengthy absence, and again recalled the seemingly genial relations that Isabella and Hugh had shown in front of the king. It doesn't seem to have dawned on Edward that Isabella and Hugh were putting on a front for his benefit. Inside, Isabella was absolutely seething, whilst Hugh continued to calculate ways in his mind of elevating himself in the king's esteem, and not to mention his own wealth, even at the queen's expense. Edward was a naive and gullible man, and the performative niceties of both Hugh and Isabella clearly wrong-footed him. After dispatching the letters to Isabella and Charles, Edward turned his attentions to his son. Acknowledging the prince's tender age, the king urged the younger Edward to join his mother and return to England. If Isabella would not come, then the prince was to take his leave from her anyway and return to England himself. How Edward II expected that of a 13-year-old boy is anybody's guess. The prince was under his mother's control and influence, placed in a terrible dilemma. By March 1326, little had changed, despite further correspondence between both sides. In a further letter addressed to his son that month, the king made plain his hostility to a certain earl named Roger Mortimer, whom Isabella had attached herself to. Mortimer, like many nobles, had grown disaffected by Edward's rule, and, in order to escape to France, had broken out of prison in the Tower of London in dramatic fashion. Mortimer was now a very dangerous enemy to Edward II, who called Mortimer our mortal foe. Again, Edward beseeches the prince to return to him, but this time with a slightly more agitated tone, expressing how displeased he was with the younger Edward. Once more, you must wonder what the king really expected his son to do. There was an alternative option for Edward II, and that was to go and retrieve his son himself, but that would mean leaving Hugh in England with his many enemies. Edward II would again beseech Charles IV to send Isabella back to him, continuing to plead Hugh's innocence, and again he would plead with Prince Edward to return to England, all to no avail. Edward's correspondences with his son seem to me to be scrambled in thought. He both chastises his heir, yet acknowledges both the younger Edward's age and innocence in the matter. There was little the prince could do, under the thumb as he was of Isabella and, in particular, Roger Mortimer. Perhaps Edward II knew this and was writing out of sheer desperation. There was one simple alternative for Edward II that may have won Isabella round and returned her and young Edward to the king's side. That would have been to have banished Hugh Despenser for good. This was a solution that could have saved Edward's crown. That's if Edward had been capable of doing it, which he clearly wasn't. Piers Gaveston had been banished several times, only for Edward to recall him each time. The same would happen again, and Isabella knew this. Her anger and sense of injustice was now such that revenge against her husband and Hugh was now an inevitability. Supported by Mortimer, and with young Edward at her side, Isabella landed in England in the autumn of 1326 at the head of an army that would soon grow, marching against her own husband.